Okay, hi everyone. My name is Alys Tomlinson, and today I'm going to be sharing some of my personal photographic projects with you, which I hope you'll find interesting. I'm just going to share my screen now to get started. Okay, now this was kind of billed as an in conversation, I think, but it's turned out this is kind of an in conversation with myself, essentially. I was hoping that this would be live, but it seems that work has taken me back to Belarus, where I'm currently making a film about a nun called Vera that I will be talking about a bit later. And I will hopefully be able to still join in and watch this and answer questions as we go along. So please, if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat, which I believe is on the right hand side. I just think there probably isn't good enough Wi-Fi to actually do this live. So this is pre-recorded actually from Arsenal, where I live in North London, but this is the first time I believe that this has been kind of aired or screened or whatever. So thanks very much for joining anyway. I'm going to talk a little bit today, first of all, a little bit of an introduction to me and my work and how I tend to mix personal work with commissioned work. So personal projects, which are mainly long-term projects, with my commissioned work, which is mainly editorial, a bit of advertising and work for design agencies. And then really talk about my three major projects of the last few years and give you a kind of insight into my process there. So just to give you a little bit of background, I didn't actually study photography initially. I studied English literature and communications, but I do feel that a lot of my kind of thought process really is based around visual language. So the way I think is often connected to the way I see, and the way I see and see the world, if you like, often comes through literature and poetry and film. And I feel that these all really kind of feed into the way I see the world and the way I use my camera. I did then study photography kind of formally at Central St Martin's in London. It used to be on Charing Cross Road, and that was where I really got my kind of technical training. But my background initially was more in humanities, and I was always encouraged to be very kind of curious about the world and to be very inquisitive. My mum was a film studies teacher at sixth form college. My dad is an academic and sociologist. So we always had a lot of books around us, which I think really helped me visualize the world in a literary way, I guess, and think about kind of characters and storytelling and narrative, but not just through photography. So I suppose I was lucky to be kind of visually aware from a young age, but I didn't really see photography as a career at that point. That wasn't until I was a bit older. And I suppose my big break really came when I moved to New York when I was in my early 20s, and I started working for Time Out because Time Out had just launched there. And I actually got my first assignment, which was all the travel photographs for the Time Out Guide to New York, which sent me all over the city. So it was a real adventure for me. I was photographing bars and clubs and shops and sites and just wandering the city for hours and hours on end, getting to know the city really well, really understanding the kind of fabric of this city and how it worked and how it kept going and its energy and its vibrancy. And that was a great kind of learning curve for me. And then I came back and continued to work for Time Out for quite a long time. But today, rather than focus on my commercial work and my commission work, I'm actually going to talk about my personal projects, because I guess these are projects that have become very important to me and really the kind of focus and the focal point of what I do now. And this is the kind of practice and the work that I want to make more of going forwards. So as you can see, this is just a grab from my website, but I do divide quite distinctly my personal works and my projects from my commissions. And as you can see, there's already a kind of very big visual difference between my projects, a lot of which is black and white now, and which is all of those projects were shot on film, and my commission work, which tends to be kind of lifestyle-ish, people and places, very natural, quite reportagey, and nearly without exception, that's all shot on digital. I use Canons mainly for that. So there's quite a distinct kind of separation there from a technical point of view, I guess, and I'm fairly confident using both. But my personal projects for me are really where I want to be. They're kind of what makes me tick, and that's the work that's most fulfilling for me. So that's why I'm going to spend today talking mostly about my personal work. So I'm going to start by actually showing you a picture of a film that was really important to me and had a great kind of impact on the way I thought and my first big major project. So up until this point, as you could see from the previous slide, I'd started personal projects, but I'd never really kind of invested in them fully in terms of, you know, emotionally, financially, kind of psychologically. And partly that was because I was always so worried about just the reality of surviving as a photographer, you know, making a living, paying the bills, the boring stuff that we all need to do. And because of that, my priority was making money, not making a lot of money, but making enough money to survive. That was my priority over actually creating work that was very significant and meaningful for me. And lots of the time I just felt very lucky to even be working as a photographer. But this film really had a big impact on me, and it's really hard to say exactly kind of what happened and why. It wasn't like I suddenly awoke and had a kind of big spiritual moment or anything like that, but I saw this film, a film by a female director called Jessica Hausner, about Lourdes, which is obviously a very well-known place of pilgrimage in the south of France, in the Pyrenees. And it just looked like an absolutely fascinating place to me. And this is bearing in mind that I've been brought up, if anything, in a very atheist household. So religion and faith and devotion was not part of my upbringing in any way. So it wasn't really anything that I'd given kind of too much thought for, in a sense. Although, you know, there were times when I would sit in a church and I would kind of feel something, and it's hard to describe what it is, but I would enjoy the contemplative nature of being there. And I was kind of interested in the rituals and things like that. So there was some interest in what drove people to have these strong beliefs, but I had never kind of shared these beliefs myself. I saw this film and immediately it just struck me as a place of great kind of mystery and intrigue and depth. And it's a very, very beautiful film. It's actually a fiction film as opposed to a documentary. But I decided I wanted to find out more. This was 5 years ago now. I then started doing some research, because with every project I do, the research is a really crucial part of the whole kind of learning process for me, and actually does affect the final outcome. So I will always look at previous work, and obviously somewhere like Lourdes has been photographed, you know, widely over the years. This isn't a incredibly original subject matter that no one's ever photographed. And actually, the kind of longer I'm a photographer, the more I realize that nothing is truly original. You know, you can think you found the most kind of obscure subject matter to photograph and to document, and you'll probably find out that someone at some stage has already been there and done that. But it's really about doing it in your own way. So I started looking at photography that already existed of Lourdes. So a lot of these pictures, obviously all in black and white, but very, very famous photographers had been there. You know, we can see there's Joseph Kudelka, and this is what it used to look like, Lourdes, a grotto with really hundreds of crutches hanging up, because Lourdes became known, it was all to do with an apparition, a young peasant girl called St. Bernadette. Well, she was Bernadette at the time, who had a series of apparitions of the Virgin Mary at grotto in Lourdes. And it then became a place of kind of great faith and devotion, and people would go there hoping to be cured. So it also became known as a place of kind of miraculous cures. So there are all these stories attached to it. I then found out that, you know, Giacomelli had been there, Henri Cartier-Bresson. So these are like very, very well-known, famous photographers who had created bodies of work in Lourdes. So it wasn't a truly original subject matter. It was more about what I would bring to this story, if you like, and what I would bring to the scene of Lourdes, and how I would tell how I felt when I was in this place. So I actually ended up quite early, well, very early on in the project, obviously, kind of booking a almost pilgrim package tour to Lourdes. So I bundled off there, and at this point I had a medium format camera and colour film. But I really spent the first week there feeling very lost, feeling that I didn't really fit in, feeling like quite an imposter. And I would see some of these scenes, like I really adore these photographs. I would see some of these scenes that I had already seen when I'd been doing my research. And actually the thing that kind of stood out for me most when I was in Lourdes was how, although a lot of these were taken, you know, good 50 years after these images, you would still see people in Lourdes kind of dressed very, very traditionally, very, very devout people who would just sit for hours kind of thinking and praying. And it was this sense of being kind of taken to a different time and era altogether. And Lourdes is a really odd place. So I don't know if any of you have been there, but on some levels, it's like the kind of Vegas of the Catholic world. You know, it's very tacky in some ways. You're surrounded by souvenir shops. There's, you know, you can buy a 6-foot glow in the dark Virgin Mary. I mean, it's ridiculous on one level. But on the other level, and the reason that I was kind of drawn to it and that I really started, things really started kind of resonate with me there, was that there were these little pockets of Lourdes that were actually away from the kind of tourist areas. Like you can see in the background, this picture on the right, the kind of trees and the forests and these natural landscapes of these kind of sacred sites, but these very natural landscapes that felt like they held so much. And the more I went to Lourdes, the more I began to kind of get an understanding of how these sites worked. And what I should point out here is that I actually spent around 3 years going to Lourdes and not taking a single image that I really liked. This was all in colour at this point. And I was getting very frustrated because I'd kind of seen this as this big project that I was going to put everything into, and it was quite a breakthrough project for me in some ways in terms of the commitment I was giving to it, but the images weren't working. I was taking images that were perfectly kind of nice, they were good photos, but I felt that they seemed like they were out of a kind of travel magazine. Or a nice editorial. They didn't have a great deal of depth to me, and I hadn't really connected with what Lourdes was all about. So I spent 3 years going back. By this time I'd kind of really got to know the place and I'd amassed a lot of knowledge, and I'd also, kind of throwing this in, but I did an MA in the anthropology of travel, tourism and pilgrimage. So I ended up writing my dissertation about phenomenology, which is about lived experience and the connection of the body to the landscape and how this related to my experience in Lourdes. And I actually ended up spending a lot of time just sitting around on the riverbanks by the River Gave or by the grotto, just observing and watching and taking notes. And I think this really fed into the way I thought. So I feel that my literature and my anthropology and my interest in film all kind of came together. Now, by this point, this was 3 years into the project, I was still felt like I was getting nowhere. And as I'm sure you can kind of relate to this, I was really ready to give up on the project altogether. You know, I'd spent a lot of money at this stage. I'd paid for an assistant to come with me on some trips because a lot of the pilgrims there spoke French and Spanish and Italian, and my language skills are not competent enough to be able to converse with them. And also it was great to have Cecile there, my friend and assistant, just as a huge kind of moral support to kind of, at the end of the day, talk through the project. But the images, as I said, weren't working. I walked away from Lourdes and I thought, is that it? Do I just end it there? Do I give up? Or do I go back one final time? And as I said, it's very hard to explain very articulately exactly what kept drawing me back to Lourdes, especially as a person without those religious beliefs, without sharing the same devotion that a lot of these people did. But at this point, I'd almost become kind of weirdly fond of Lourdes. So I decided I would go back one last time. And this then became the project Ex-Voto. And it seemed to me so obvious. But when I went back, instead of shooting medium format colour, I need to shoot black and white because there is something about the people there and the landscape that is so kind of pure and so simple in some ways, but with so much kind of complexity and depth in other ways, that it almost demands to be seen in black and white. It's almost like colour is too much, you can't take it all in. And I started thinking about how I really felt when I was there. So at this point, I'd been going there for 3 years. I had a really good sense of what it represented and what it meant to people. I'd written my dissertation, I'd finished my MA in anthropology. And it seemed so obvious, but the images need to be shot in black and white, and they need to just be slowed down so much so that it's so much more considered, so that the process is more considered. There's a rhythm to how I work. You know, every image is kind of very precisely set up. So I went back kind of on one last chance, if you like, this time bringing my really ancient old large format camera that you can see here, and a load of probably expired film that I had lying around, because you can't even get this film anymore, the ready load film. kind of bundled off there. And also I should add that the film Lourdes that I showed in the beginning, that had been a big influence on me, focused on a group of people from an organisation called the Order of Malta, which is a big Catholic organisation who often people from quite privileged backgrounds, actually. I mean, it dates back hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's kind of related to nobility, and yeah, it's a very kind of historical organisation with a very rich history. But what interested me about it was that the volunteers who went there as part of the Order of Malta wore these very striking outfits. So you can see here, this is a young girl from the Order of Malta. So the women wore these kind of white like headdresses that made them look a bit like nurses, and the men wore these almost kind of military type boiler suits. And they really looked like, to me, that they just stepped out of another era altogether, and I found this really fascinating. So I went back with my large format camera, not really knowing what I was going to get, but taking an approach that was very, yeah, there was a kind of an austerity to the people I was photographing, but also, I guess, an otherworldliness. So I wanted the images to almost look like you stepped out of time. So there was a stillness there, but also you got a sense of the essence of place and these sacred landscapes. So this was my kind of final attempt, and this was me kind of in action, and then the resulting images you can see. And on this first trip with this new approach, I started thinking about using the landscape as almost like a kind of natural studio to frame these images. But I was also very interested in the connections between the pilgrims and the place. So the relationship between the pilgrims and this kind of natural environment that they inhabited. So I began to make connections between individuals like Marcus, and then the rivers and the stones and the rocks. And actually, when I had been studying for my MA, I was in one of my seminars and someone mentioned this term Ex-Voto. And I actually hadn't heard this at this point. And once I found out what it was, which meant it referred to these offerings of devotion that are left at pilgrimage sites, I started realizing that I'd seen these all around Lourdes, and I hadn't quite known, well, I hadn't known there was a kind of official term for them, but I'd always found them very kind of touching and moving. So for instance, here we have someone who's left a prayer note like folded up really, really tight and put under a wooden cross. And I started tying these together. So I started tying together the ex-votos themselves. So these very small gestures that meant so much for the people who left them behind, and the pilgrims, and these kind of wider natural landscapes. And I then had these three kind of strands working together. And if I just go back to Marcus for a second, this was actually one of the portraits I took with this new approach. And as soon as I got back the contact sheets, it wasn't obviously that every photograph was amazing, but they had somehow captured what I wanted to capture and what I wanted to feel when I was there, and how I did feel when I was there. So there was a kind of formality there, and a kind of oddness and a slight strangeness, but they also expressed this very kind of considered approach, and they encompass the natural landscape and the person as an individual. So once I'd kind of figured out this approach, the project kind of flowed much more. So as you can see, this is another young girl from the Order of Malta. And then I started to explore sites in Lourdes that were kind of off the tourist track. So this is a kind of crypt that I found up in the woods off the Stations of the Cross. So a lot of people would do the Stations of the Cross, which is obviously where you go to each station and you say your vows and you pray. But I actually found this kind of slightly sinister grotto, which was off the beaten track, and housed this Virgin Mary with the crucifix, this kind of icon in the background, really enveloped by these very dramatic kind of rocks. So I started then to discover these little pockets of Lourdes that weren't really part of the tourist trail, but that kind of held something like deeply religious and deeply meaningful, but also had this slightly kind of ominous feel to them as well. I then, once the project kind of started going and I got a rhythm in terms of the way I worked, decided to expand it to 2 other pilgrimage sites. So I then went to Grabarka, which is this one, which is the eastern side of Poland, near the border of Belarus. And I'd seen this online and I didn't really know what to expect, but I just thought it looked amazing because it was this forest just with thousands of wooden crosses. So pilgrims went there and they left their crosses kind of in the soil, like embedded in the landscape. And again, this was all research done, you know, through the internet, which allows us to reach these stories and these places in a way we couldn't otherwise. But I had never been to Poland, so I employed my kind of assistant and friend Cecile to come with me, and we went on a kind of road trip around Poland, across lots of potholed roads, and we reached Grabarka, which was again very stunning and almost quite occult-like, obviously with all these crosses kind of piled up and piled up. And I then managed to find some pilgrims there who I photographed again for the project, again on large format, in this very kind of still and quiet way. And it was quite, once I kind of got into a rhythm of it, I realized that I didn't want any extraneous kind of information or distractions. So I was very deliberate when I approached people in terms of where I would photograph them. So often I would set up my camera and my tripod, and I would use my assistant as, you know, to get the focus correct and everything. And then I would find people who interest me and ask them if they would be willing to have their photograph taken. And this was a young girl, young Polish girl, who had come for the feast day, which is an annual, very significant day in the Orthodox religious calendar. So in Lourdes, the site is Catholic, Roman Catholic, and in Grabarka, it's actually Orthodox Christian. I then found around the site in Poland these very kind of striking landscapes. So this again is right below where the crosses are, and it's this kind of swampy water with the trees all converging and going up into the sky. And yeah, there was something quite kind of mystical and magical, but also slightly sinister about this that really, really interests me. So at this point, the project was really developing. This again is Sister Agnes in Poland. Sometimes, you know, some days were really tough. Some days I wouldn't take a single picture. I wouldn't really see anyone of interest. Some days Grabarka was unbelievably quiet. So we'd be kind of sitting there with our little packed lunch, not taking a single frame. Obviously also shooting on 5:4 film, large format film, you know, I'm aware of the cost of it. So I'm always thinking how much it's costing me. And I would only do between 1 and maybe 4, 6 at most. That was one exception. No, it was I think 4 at most, sorry, of each person, because I'm aware of how much this is costing. So I wasn't shooting and shooting and shooting. Some days I wouldn't take a single plate. And often after a week's work, I would maybe have between 30 and 40 images that I would then bring back to process. But at this point, I just felt that the project was kind of getting deeper and it was getting richer. And I had these 3 themes that kind of aligned with the ex-votos. As you can see here, it's a bit hard to see, but someone has left a little kind of cross from a rosary. Again, there's these prayer notes that have been folded up tight and kind of put into the crevice of the rocks. And I felt very moved by what I saw. I still didn't share the devotion, and I certainly haven't kind of converted in any way. But I found, I think, a newfound kind of respect for people's beliefs. And I also saw what they gained from having this, the strength that they got from this kind of deep faith, and also the strength that they got from their own spirituality. So that was really interesting for me, because it was not a part of my character or my upbringing or my family at all, but I began to see it in other people, and I could see what they gained from their deep beliefs. This again is in Poland. It's a chapel on the side of the road, and this is a male priest we met. And then I found things like this old kind of shack that I thought looked like it was something out of a Grimm's fairy tale or something, all decrepit and dilapidated with the roof caved in. So I started to find these landscapes that were kind of beautiful in their own way, but also slightly odd. And that really kind of interests me. This again is a young girl. This portrait was taken in Grabarka. And then we've got some other examples here of the ex-votos. And often the ex-votos that were left were very, very simple. So you can see here that it's just a cross that's been made out of twigs and kind of tied together with some leaves left on a rock in the water. And a lot of the landscapes I ended up photographing did have these recurring themes, really, of water, of rock, of stone, that all came together to form these sacred sites. This is another one from Grabarka. And I then, for my third location, I ended up focusing closer to home, and I found a tiny village called Ballyverney in Ireland that I just loved, because unlike the other places where I felt a little bit more anonymous, in Ballyverney it's such a tiny place, and it has a site called St Gobnets, which is of a kind of immense meaning to the local community. And a lot of these stories of why the pilgrimage site started as well are kind of tied up in kind of mythical tales. And this was started because a young girl had a vision of 9 white deer, and she had this vision, and it was very much linked to Christianity, or actually pagan at the times, because it was from many years ago. And it became well known for somewhere, again, where people could get cured. So it became this kind of site of healing, and villagers would, flock there from very, very close by. And it's still really the centre and the heart of this community. And again, I started noticing ex-votos in Ireland, but these were actually different. So in Lourdes, you would get the notes that were kind of tied up, the prayer notes, and folded up and put into the rock. And you would still get this in Ireland, but in Ireland you would also get the ribbons attached to the twigs. This was widely used as a sign of devotion. And for instance, here you can see it's very sad. It's a kind of decaying motorist prayer. So someone has left the prayer for someone who's either been injured or killed in a car accident. So I found these very small gestures like incredibly kind of touching and moving and meaningful. And then I started to explore the landscapes in Ireland as well. So you have these kind of misty forests, and then at St Gobnets you have crosses etched onto the rocks that have been kind of etched over and over many years, this kind of piece of history that's embedded in the landscape. So at this point the project was really coming together, and then one of the most kind of significant meetings I had in the project was Sister Vera, who you can see here, who I first met in Grabarka, and who really kind of took me by surprise, because I'd never seen anyone quite like her. And as soon as I saw her, I knew there was something kind of very, very special about her. So I asked if I could take her photo, really not knowing what she would be like at all. And she was like, of course, ladies. And she really, really loved it, and she agreed. And actually, I think this portrait either took 4 or 6 shots. I don't remember exactly. I would have to check my contact sheets. But there was something about her that was incredibly powerful. She had this just very, very strong and very, very spiritual presence. And it sounds very dramatic when I say it now, but when I kind of had the loop on the glass and I was focusing, it almost felt like she was like looking right into my soul. So it was a very kind of powerful moment for me. And she became kind of one of the leading images, if you like, from the whole series. So at this point, it was really coming together, the project. I had 3 sites. I had Ballyverney in Ireland, Grabarka in Poland, and Lourdes in the south of France. And they all tied together to kind of tell this narrative of belief and spirituality, but also, yes, this sense of stepping out into a different era, of them being kind of somehow out of time, with these kind of hazy, impressionistic backdrops, but also the emphasis was very much on the individual and their relationship to the landscapes. So the project started to kind of really gain momentum, and it ended up being really 2 years of work from when the images started working. So I did at that point kind of explore entering a few competitions. Now, I'm not someone who enters like hundreds of photo competitions. I kind of keep an eye on, who are on certain juries, the people on certain juries, and the judges, and which competitions might be interesting for me and interesting to my work. But I'd actually never entered the Sony before. So I entered the Sony, obviously not really expecting to get anywhere. This was in 2018, and I won the discovery category, which was amazing. A big surprise, but really, really wonderful. And then won the Photographer of the Year award. And I guess I was partly surprised, just because these images had become really deeply personal by this point. They were very kind of quiet images. They were very still images. They were seen as about religion, although they're not really about religion per se. So I didn't really know if they would have very much appeal to other people. So when I won, it was, obviously a huge, huge honour. I did win quite a big amount of prize money, which kind of reimbursed me for the project, but was incredibly helpful in, the practical side of things, and also allowing me to go on and make more work. And I have to say that it did really kind of change the trajectory of my career. I got huge exposure from it, and it just gave me, you know, an enormous amount of confidence to kind of carry on. So partly as a result of that, I then published this book, which I have here, which is actually now sold out, although you can get it on a few websites, I think, called Ex-Voto. I worked with a publisher called Stu Smith, a designer who has a publisher called Gost, and managed to produce this book that I'm actually very proud of. I had to do a Kickstarter that was, you know, completely draining and difficult, because this is a whole other story, but I'm sure, as you know, a lot of book publishers now are not willing to take any risks, so they rely entirely on the photographer paying for the production, which I don't think is very fair, but anyway, that's how it is, unfortunately. But I did a Kickstarter, and I think because of the Sony Award, and it got quite a lot of press at this point, it kind of picked up momentum, and I was able to raise a lot of money on the Kickstarter, which paid for the printing and the production of the book. So it was very lovely to be able to produce a book. I mean, I wanted it to be kind of simple and elegant, but to really kind of do justice to the work as well, because there's such a lot of detail in the images, because they're shot on such, you know, big negatives. I wanted you to really be able to almost feel you were in these landscapes when I was there. Even if you don't share any of the faith or any of the belief, I wanted you to somehow connect with what I had photographed, and I really hope that's the case. So it's lovely to have something kind of tangible. The project then kind of, got quite a lot of, that's from the book, exposure, and I had a show at the Rencontre Arles Photo Festival in 2019, where I won the Prix du Public, which was the public award, which was fantastic, because I've been to this festival about 10 years on the trot now, and I've always absolutely loved it, and it's always been a real dream to show my work there. So to actually have a show there and to win this award was, it was incredible for me. This is a couple more pictures, installation pictures from the show. So this really marked a big turning point in my career. It was, as I said, the first time that I had really committed fully to a personal project. So it had taken me actually 5 years in total, from the initial trip to Lourdes, the kind of pilgrim package tour and the images not working, to actually producing this book with Gost. And I actually realise now that, you know, good work takes time often, and I would prefer to spend another 5 years on a personal project and produce something really strong and meaningful, even if I'm ancient by the time that happens, rather than to kind of feel pressure to, you know, bash out another project because I have to. So a lot of my project involves a lot of thinking and a lot of research, and I think these all kind of come together to actually form the final body of work. Now, as a result of the Sony, I ended up making a film about Vera, the nun, who I showed you a photograph earlier. Here she is again, Sister Vera. Now, the reason this happened was because I won the Sony Photographer of the Year award, which was, as I said, amazing. I also got money from Sony, a grant to make new work. I think they awarded 5 of the winners in the categories money to make new work. Now, at this point, I hadn't actually finished Ex-Voto. So I thought, well, how about I use the money to finish the project? But then I found out that you had to use Sony equipment. And I thought, well, that's not going to work, because the whole point of working on Ex-Voto was that it's this incredibly slow and considered and precise way. And if I suddenly switch to digital, the images are going to have a completely different feel. It's not going to work. So I don't want to lose this opportunity to use the grant, but, you know, what do I do, and how do I kind of make an extension of what I've already done? And I actually spoke to Mike Troe, who was head of the judges, and chairman, I think, of judges, and I think he is again this year. And he said to me, well, have you thought about making a film? And I also got given a Sony camera as part of the prize from the Discovery Award that I'd won. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that's a good idea. You know, it would be something different for me. And also, Vera had actually invited myself and Cecile, my assistant. And Cecile, I should also point out, is a very accomplished filmmaker in her own right. Cecile had invited us to visit her in the convent, but she'd said it in quite a kind of loose way, and we'd kind of forgotten about it and thought it would probably never happen. So when I got the grant, I thought, well, why don't we get back in touch with her, actually? and see if she's open to the idea of us coming. And it's quite funny because in lots of ways she lives obviously a very monastic life, and they adhere to many rules and rituals from thousands of years ago, in fact, these kind of archaic way of living, but also a lot of them are on kind of WhatsApp and email. So she did have email, so I emailed her, and she replied straight back saying, yes, come whenever you want. So we decided to go. This was about 2.5 years ago now. It was August 2018, I think, so in the summer, with a view to making a short film about Vera's life. And again, having done my research for Lourdes and looked at photographers who'd photographed pilgrimages there, I looked at films that could perhaps relate in style and in terms of the aesthetic to what we were trying to do. What I was really keen to do was to have this film as really an extension of Ex-Voto. So I wanted to employ a similar style, to shoot it in black and white, to be very carefully composed. So all these elements would come together. So it was almost like a kind of extension of the project, and you could tell very clearly that they were related to one another. So this is Ida by Paweł Kowski, who is a Polish director whose work I really love. And I also looked at films like Mother Joan of the Angels, The Turin Horse by Bela Tarr, which is amazing. And a lot of kind of Russian and Eastern European filmmakers as well, to try and get a sense of the kind of mood and the tone that I was going to capture. And this is also bearing in mind that I've never kind of seen myself as a filmmaker. I've been interested in film, but I never thought I would try kind of directing film myself. I went to the Tarkovsky exhibition in Amsterdam a year or so ago, and Tarkovsky's been a big influence on the way I think and the way I work as well. But I don't have experience as a filmmaker. So I was very conscious that I was kind of going into the unknown to a certain extent. But the relationship developed with Vera. I did a short film that was shown at Rencontre Arles. And very soon on, Cecile and I realised that she is a character with such depth and such an incredible history and past life that we needed to go back more. So we've actually now been back 4 times, and I'm hoping by the time you see this that I'll be back in Belarus again. And part of the reason for this is that Vera is just an extraordinarily unusual character. She's almost the most orthodox nun you could meet, really. This is her in the bottom right, like pulling a silly face and sticking her tongue out, and that's me in the top left with some sound equipment and with one of her horses. She has this extraordinary relationship with the horses, which is part of her obedience. But she's such a kind of rich character that the short film didn't do her justice. So we're now actually working on a documentary feature film, and we're very lucky to have been supported and got some funding from the Sundance Institute, which we hope will finish next year. Vera is a really complex character. She's amazing, but she is difficult, as I think a lot of the most interesting people are. And there's this continual kind of push and pull with her. Like, she'll be very generous and she'll give you a lot of her time, a lot of her energy, and then she'll almost withdraw and retreat a bit. So you feel like you're kind of playing this game with her. But she's become, a close friend in lots of ways as well. And I have huge amounts of respect for the decisions she's made, because actually her life beforehand was the opposite of her life now, in that she had a very, very troubled kind of teenage time. Like, she was in with the wrong crowd. She became very quickly addicted to drugs and alcohol. She became part of the kind of underbelly of the community, the kind of bohemian artistic community in Minsk, but it had a very, very dark side. And she nearly died. She overdosed and nearly died on several occasions. And she really felt that she was at the end of her life. And she feels that joining the convent saved her. I mean, that's a very kind of potted history of her life. But she felt that it was either, she said herself, the cemetery or the convent for her. So she had this extraordinary kind of turnaround in her life and became a nun. This was over 20 years ago now, at the age of 21, I think, 20. So she has got this very checkered past. She's also incredibly intelligent, very smart, very articulate, and we are trying to tell her story and kind of do her story justice through moving image. So here are a couple of stills. So this is all being shot on Sony equipment, which we found actually to be, this isn't just a plug for their equipment, but we have found it to be excellent in low light. And often in the church, you know, we're in these very dark kind of candle lit shadowy spaces, and we have to be very very kind of invasive, so not uninvasive, invasive, not invasive. You know, we're working just the two of us. We need to be kind of quick sometimes. We need to not have to have tons of equipment. We haven't got a big crew or anything. So actually working with the kind of very small cameras has been a great help to us. So these are again some more stills you can see here. She's got this extraordinarily kind of sensual relationship with the horses who she looks after as part of her obedience. And we filmed this whole scene, which was almost became a piece of performance art really, with her lying and caressing the horses, and she feels an incredible pull towards the horses in terms of what they kind of represent spiritually. So I think aside from her relationship with God, actually her relationship with the horses is kind of as important, and it really is what kind of keeps her going. What's also really important about, this is her again with the horse, the convent, is that they have a rehabilitation centre on some rural farmlands not far from the convent itself, where 200 men who have had terrible experiences with drugs, with alcohol, with addiction, or they've just been left by their families. They're often found at railway stations, they're found in forests, they're kind of dumped at the gates by their families. And these are men really on the edge of society who have suffered so much. I mean, Belarus is it's volatile at the moment politically, but it's an incredibly harsh country. There's very little employment prospects there. And these are men really on the edge of society. And what's interesting as well is that Vera kind of shares their pain, and she can perhaps empathize with them in a way that some of the other sisters can't. So she has a very, very close relationship with the men. And we've managed to go now over 4 seasons. So this is a still from Vera, like galloping through thick, thick snow. This was in January 2019. Yes, it was freezing cold. But we're really trying to weave together Vera's inner world of the horses and her own kind of psychology with the outer world of the men. So these are some stills, and you can see the men here all lined up in the rehabilitation centre. So she has a very close relationship with the men, and it's almost like she can feel and sense their suffering. And she's quite a wild character. She's quite playful. She's very unpredictable. But then also she obviously has the kind of rigid discipline of the convent. So she's interesting because she's, even within the convent, she's kind of living 2 parallel lives, and she's trying to make it all work. And we can see that sometimes that's a real struggle for her, because the strict rules and the kind of regime that is required to be a nun is not what comes naturally to Vera. You know, Vera herself has said that she's tried everything that's forbidden, and the more forbidden it is, the more interesting it is to her. And she has that kind of personality. And despite taking her vows and becoming a nun, that's part of who she is, that innate to her. So I think she has this inner struggle going on the whole time. This is another shot from the film. So this is very much project in progress, but we have now gone 4 times, and I'm hoping that this last trip we'll be able to kind of work on the final chapter, if you like, and close the film in terms of what we're trying to say with the narrative and the narrative art we're creating, and really, be able to tell the story very kind of truthfully, but very rawly as well, about her incredible life. So hopefully you might be able to see that next year, and we're hoping it's going to go to festivals and be released. So I'm going to talk a little bit more, just for a few minutes, about my final project, or my most recent project, which is called Lost Summer. And this was a project that was really born out of the difficulties of COVID and the pandemic and the ramifications of that. And the reason I started this project was because I myself was bored and frustrated. I was supposed to be working on a project in Italy, which was obviously was not possible. I really wanted to get back to Belarus to work on the film, and that wasn't possible. So I started thinking instead about how I could make work, you know, locally and around North London where I live. And I'd seen a lot of teenagers just hanging around the streets with nothing else to do really. And I started thinking about how the teenagers were kind of one of the worst segments of society in terms of how they'd been affected most badly by the pandemic. You know, a lot of them had gone into school only to be told just not to come back again. They'd had their exams cancelled. Their end of year celebrations had been, you know, postponed and then cancelled, and they really had nothing to mark this really significant stage in their lives of growing up and becoming an adult. And I started thinking about when I was that age, and you have these moments and these stages that do mark this kind of this moment where you go from being a teenager and from kind of childhood up into adulthood, and that these were really kind of stolen from them. And I started thinking how difficult that must be and how sad that was. So I actually initially had the idea because I was speaking to a friend who's got teenage kids, and she said how disappointed they were to be missing their prom. And I started thinking, well, how about doing a series of portraits of teenagers kind of all dressed up for the prom that never happened, if you like. So I said to my friend Viv, you know, would your daughter be up for it? Because they had their proms cancelled and exams cancelled, and she was called Nancy. And she said, yeah, I'm sure Nancy would be up for it, and her boyfriend Jack. And this is Jack. So I went over in June. It was actually a really, really blustery, cold day in June. And they lived just around the corner. So I kind of went off with my tripod and my wheelie suitcase, and I'd loaded up some film, and we photographed them in my friend Viv's garden. And I didn't really know what to expect. It was more to give me something to do really at that stage than anything else. I didn't think of the long-term prospects of this project, but it actually became something that I really loved doing. And I ended up photographing 44 teenagers from June to September. And the reason I stopped was mainly because the school started to go back in September 2020. So it felt like there was kind of natural closure to the project. But I really love this project. And I think it also made me realise that although I often do rely quite heavily on travel to do my projects and to make new work, actually it really made me look closer to what's kind of around me and on my doorstep and what I see every day, and how the everyday can also be really interesting. You know, I've lived in this neighbourhood for 14 years. I thought I knew it so well, but there's actually pockets of it that I'd never visited before. And what happened with this project was, once kind of word of mouth got out about the project, the teenagers, a lot of them didn't have very much to do, of course, last summer. They couldn't see their mates, they couldn't go on holiday, they couldn't do the kind of things they'd normally do. So they really enjoyed, I think, having something to focus on. They'd spent so long in their kind of cooped up in their bedrooms that they really enjoyed, you know, dressing up and having their picture taken. And also really loved the fact, or found it very interesting, that I was working with this very big old-fashioned camera, because they're the kind of generation that is used to obviously selfies and instantaneous images. And I think they actually, a lot of them found it fascinating that I was using this almost like ancient kind of old-fashioned camera, and that they had to be very patient, they had to be very still. And I think they enjoyed the whole process. I was also very conscious that I wanted to obviously reflect the kind of diversity of my neighbourhood. So it started off with some friends of friends, and then I have some other friends who are teachers, so they put something in the school newsletter to kind of advertise the project and see if any of the kids at their schools were interested. So I would then have various teens kind of texting me and saying they were interested in the project. And I actually began, when I started the project, my initial thought was that I might photograph these teenagers in their bedrooms, because I've always been also fascinated by teenagers' bedrooms and how much it tells you about their, you know, their character and their identity, and how they carve out these spaces just for themselves, these kind of private spaces. But I then started thinking that you could easily make judgments about them in terms of their, you know, their class, their background, their families, their privilege, if you like. And I really didn't want that to be a factor at all. What I wanted to focus on was, like, for instance, this is Drew, you know, his strength and his resilience. So I then decided actually what would be better. I hadn't shot anything with the bedrooms. When I did the first one, Jack, I thought, let's instead use these very kind of democratic spaces, so these outdoor spaces. So I ended up photographing the kids, if teenagers, if they had gardens, in their gardens. If they didn't have gardens, I would photograph them in their backyards or local parks. So I kind of used, again, in a similar way to Ex-Voto, I used the natural landscape to really kind of frame these images. And it's, you know, it's hard to say exactly what kind of characteristic each teenager emanates, because some of them are a little bit more apprehensive. Some of them, they're much kind of stronger, they have a much stronger presence than others. But I felt that they were all dealing incredibly well with a very, very difficult situation. And I had a lot of admiration for them because of this. And I started to kind of just, build up this kind of portfolio of images of local teenagers who each could almost represent a different kind of characteristic or feeling. And again, in a similar way to Ex-Voto with Vera, I was kind of hoping that you would see some of their inner world, but that they were almost framed by the outer world. This is Samuel, who's one of my favourites. I should also mention that there was no like casting or styling involved. So I didn't know, a lot of the teenagers, I didn't know what they'd look like. I would just kind of turn up and we would have a little chat. So I would chat to them all individually first, and I wouldn't be specific in any way about what they should wear. It was entirely up to them. So I really wanted this sense of individuality to come through in the portrait. So there was no styling involved or me telling them what they should or shouldn't be wearing. It was very much up to them. And this is Inez, and I kind of got to know them all in quite a short space of time and became really kind of fond of them. As I said, I really admired how they were handling the situation with a great kind of maturity and resilience. This is Alfie, who was lovely. He said he'd spent most of his summer immersed in the land of Hogwarts. And then I ended the project with Ruth. So this is just a small selection. And actually, when the schools went back at that point, I'd photographed 44 teenagers, and it felt like the right time to stop. But I also wanted something to, something to show the entirety of the project that people could keep, and that the teenagers could also have for themselves. I sent them all a print, but I wanted something more than that. So I then actually published this book, Lost Summer. So I don't know if I actually mentioned that the project is called Lost Summer. And really embodies, the loss that we all felt, but particularly the loss that these teenagers felt in a kind of myriad of ways. And it's a very, very simple book. It's, it's relatively small-ish, but it contains every teenager I photographed for the project. So I didn't edit any of them out. I thought that was really important. And there's a poem at the beginning by Walt Whitman, and then there's a very lovely poem by Ruth. This is Ruth Ann at the end of the book that talks about her experience of the pandemic. So I really hope it's something that the teenagers will kind of keep and treasure. And most of them have been very positive about the project and have really enjoyed being a part of it. And I'm also really happy that they've got some very positive press, because I feel particularly in North London, there's so much negative press around teenagers, that it's nice that they've been seen and portrayed in an extremely kind of positive light. So again, going back to kind of competitions that I don't enter, must seem like I'm a serial competition enterer, but I'm not. But I did enter 3 portraits into the Taylor Wessing Portrait Prize, and was again very surprised when they won the whole thing. I should add that I've had years of rejection for the Taylor Wessing, so I don't just enter competitions and win. I've had many, many years of not getting anywhere, of being rejected, with the Taylor Wessing, of doing the kind of walk of shame to collect my prints. So I wasn't expecting to get anywhere. I had one image from Ex-Voto in 2017, but I think obviously the portraits being so kind of timely, and I hope very sensitive and very kind of thoughtfully observed, that the judges saw that. So it was a great honour, and I was very excited to win. And then this is the exhibition that is currently at Hacklebury Fine Art, which I hope will be opening once restrictions have been lifted, which again, they're paired with some images I took called Night Wanderings, but they again show all the 44 teens. So every teenager photographed is in the exhibition, and this is the book cover. So as I said, I ended up self-publishing this in a pandemic, which was very challenging, But I am very kind of proud that every teenager I photographed has got a copy of this book that I hope they will, you know, look at for years to come. And once we all get through this really challenging time, they'll see their own strength in the images of themselves. Right, I've been going on for a long time, so I'm going to stop this recording and say thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you haven't all fallen asleep, because I've been rambling a bit. But thank you very much, and I hope there's lots of questions that I'll be on hand to answer. And also a big thanks to Sony and Ex-Voto Video for hosting this talk. I hope you've enjoyed it.